Okay, so you want to own a medieval warship. You picture a hull rising above every merchant vessel in the harbor, royal colors over the stern, soldiers on the upper deck, and enough height and timber to make smaller ships give way. Before anyone fires a weapon, you pay for it, appoint a commander, and now the coast has to take you seriously. That is what the ship looks like from the quay. What the quay does not show you is how quickly that one ship turns into several different problems. A man has to keep the seams tight. A merchant may lose the use of his own vessel. A mariner may be waiting for wages. A lender may be holding a promise against taxes that have not been collected yet. Any one of them can delay the ship, and none of them becomes easier to control just because the hull is large. Late medieval England gives us one of the clearest ways to see this, because one king built his royal fleet from the single digits to roughly 36 ships, created several enormous vessels, and produced one ship so large that it became the visible peak of his naval ambition. That ship was the Grace Dieu. It was rated at roughly 1,400 tons burden, meaning carrying capacity rather than modern weight. It was one of the largest English royal vessels built before the 17th century. It carried only 3 recorded guns, because this was not a later broadside battleship. Its size was meant to carry men, dominate height, project royal power, and serve inside a fleet built around boarding, transport, and intimidation. It also had one known operational voyage. That voyage ended in mutiny. The interesting part is not simply that a large ship failed. Henry V could build a vessel on that scale and still discover that the most expensive object in his fleet was not necessarily the decisive one. The question is not whether the ship was impressive. It was. The question is what had to happen between possession and useful power, and which part of that process the king could never secure by owning the hull alone. Start with the word own. In late medieval England, a royal ship was the personal property of the king. It was not part of a permanent national navy in the modern sense. Ships could be purchased, built, captured, rebuilt, sold, or used to meet debts. The size of the royal fleet could rise during one reign and shrink after the ruler died. So ownership gave the king the hull, but the work around the hull was divided. The keeper of the king's ships handled construction, stores, repairs, equipment, victualling, and safekeeping. Once a vessel entered an active operation, command moved into the hands of admirals, while campaign expenses passed through war treasures. That division sounds like paperwork until something goes wrong. A commander can order a ship to sail. He cannot order rotten rope to become strong, an empty food barrel to become full, or an unpaid crew to become cooperative. Someone has to make those conditions true before the order has any value. Under Henry, one of the people closest to that problem was William Soper, a Southampton merchant and royal naval administrator. His world was not the dramatic world painted in royal chronicles. It was timber, iron rope, pitch, tar, sailcloth, docks, wages, pumps, and account rolls. Henry could decide that a great ship should exist. Soper and the people around him had to turn that decision into a floating object that did not sink. That meant coordinating work scattered far beyond one shipyard. A suitable tree was useful only after someone selected it, cut it, moved it to water, and delivered it in a form a shipwright could use. Iron was useful only after it became fastenings. A coil of rope was useful only if it arrived in the right quantity and condition. Pitch and tar mattered only if they reached the hull before water found the gap they were meant to seal. The accounts are important because they strip away the image of one royal purchase. There was no single moment when Henry handed over money and received a warship. Spending arrived in pieces, and readiness arrived only when those pieces met. A delayed material could idle skilled workers. A missing pump could threaten a completed hull. A vessel could look finished from the bank while still lacking the stores and people required to enter service. Soper therefore sits at the human center of the ownership problem. The king has the ambition and the legal title. The administrator has to answer the question that decides whether either one matters. What is missing today? Even a much smaller royal vessel shows how quickly the work spreads. In 1416, the crown built a Ballinger called the Anne. It was rated at roughly 120 tons, tiny beside the Grace Dieu, and it still required a purpose-made waterfront dock. It carried 68 oars, each around 24 feet long. Picture those oars arriving before the ship is finished. 68 long pieces of shaped timber that have to be selected, moved, stored, fitted, and paid for. Then add the keel, overlapping hull planks, iron fastenings, anchors, pumps, rigging, masts, sailcloth, pitch, tar, and the craftsmen, who know how to use all of it. Now scale the problem up until the ship is more than 10 times larger. Henry's program produced 4 great ships: the Trinity Royal, the Holy Ghost, the Jesus, and the Grace Dieu. A specialist reconstruction of the surviving accounts estimates that these 4 vessels consumed about 1/3 of total royal ship spending during Henry's reign. That is not a small budget choice. It is a concentrated wager. The estimated construction cost of the Grace Dieu was around £3,800, although the records are incomplete and any precise modern conversion would be misleading. What matters is the choice inside the medieval budget. Money committed to one great hull could not be spent at the same time on another ship, another repair, another crew, or another month of provisions, and size created obligations after construction, not just during it. The Grace Dieu's 3 recorded guns are useful because they break the modern mental picture. You were not buying a floating cannon battery, you were buying height, carrying space, a platform for soldiers and archers, and a visible statement of royal power. All of that depended on people. A master and pilot had to understand the vessel. Mariners had to work the sails and rigging. Carpenters and other specialists had to deal with damage. Soldiers and archers needed their own officers, equipment, food, and space. The people who moved the ship and the people who fought from it were not one interchangeable crew. A larger hull could carry more power, but it also created more mouths, more wages, more discipline problems, and more opportunities for one missing group to stop everyone else. That is why the real test of ownership did not come on the day the hull entered the water. It came on the day Henry needed to move an army. In 1415, Henry prepared to carry approximately 12,000 men across the Channel to France. His royal fleet was still small. Even after years of expansion, the crown would never personally own anything close to the number of vessels required for an operation on that scale. The transport fleet assembled for the crossing was roughly 700 ships, with a defensible range of around 650 to 750. They were not 700 purpose-built battle vessels. Most were commercial ships used to carry men, horses, weapons, food, and equipment. But that makes the comparison more important, not less. The army could not reach the other coast without transport, and a great royal ship could not perform the work of hundreds of cargo hulls. Orders moved outward to ports across England. Large levies could draw vessels from around 80 ports. Other ships were hired from Holland and Zealand. Masters and crews had to be located. The vessels had to assemble at the correct harbor. The army had to arrive before supplies spoiled or the sailing window changed. Imagine the harbor as the fleet comes together. A few royal ships carry the king's colors. Around them are merchant vessels that normally earn money, carrying wool, wine, grain, timber, and other cargo. The visual center may be the royal ship, but the practical scene is hundreds of masters trying to arrive, load, wait, and depart as one temporary fleet. That creates problems the hull of the Grace Dieu could never solve. Men, horses, weapons, food, and equipment had to be distributed across vessels gathered from different ports. Masters and crews had to arrive with ships that varied in capacity and condition. The crown was not moving one object. It was trying to make hundreds of separate vessels depart as one operation. The sheer number of ships is not proof that the crown had built a permanent navy. It is proof that for a limited campaign, the crown could hire or compel a commercial shipping world to behave like one. Now imagine being the owner of one of them. Your vessel has a commercial route, its crew knows the work, freight has been promised. Then a royal order takes the ship into service. The expected trading income stops. The ship may be away for months. It can be damaged, delayed, or lost. Compensation is expected, but payment may arrive late or become disputed. The owner's loss is not limited to a line on one royal account. A trading opportunity may pass while the vessel is away. The crew may return late. Repairs may be needed before ordinary work resumes. Even where payment is eventually made, the crown and the merchant are measuring different things. The crown sees transport capacity for a campaign. The owner sees an earning asset removed from its normal use. Compulsory service does not remove that cost. It changes who feels it first. That creates a dangerous balance. The crown needs merchant shipping because private trade keeps large numbers of vessels and experienced mariners active during peace. But every forced voyage interrupts the commercial work that keeps those vessels useful. Push too little, and the king cannot assemble the fleet. Push too hard or pay too slowly, and the same merchants become less willing or less able to support the next operation. And even coercion does not solve the cash problem. In November of 1414, Parliament granted Henry a double tax. That sounds like money. It was really permission to collect money later. The tax arrived in installments, including one in February of 1415, and another the following year. The army could not wait for the second installment. Foreign shipowners could not be paid with a future date written on a tax roll. Mariners expected wages, troops expected advances, food, equipment and transport had to be secured before departure. So Henry borrowed against revenue that had been authorized but not yet collected. This is where royal power becomes unexpectedly ordinary. A future tax supports a loan. The loan becomes ready cash. The cash pays for hired vessels, wages, food, and movement. The king may own land, rights, and ships, but if the money is not liquid at the moment of mobilization, the fleet stays where it is. Between February and May, Henry spent more than £7,000 on arrangements involving foreign shipping, though the exact number of ships secured and the complete cost remain debated. The figure should not be treated as the entire price of the fleet. It does show how quickly temporary capacity could absorb cash before the campaign even began. The scale comparison seems to settle the argument. A few royal ships sit inside a transport fleet of roughly 700, so perhaps the private vessels were the real fleet and the great ships were only expensive decoration. That would be too simple. The Trinity Royal carried Henry during the 1415 crossing. The Holy Ghost, rebuilt from a captured Spanish vessel, entered active service and took part in naval operations in 1416 and 1417. Large royal ships could transport, protect, intimidate, and fight. The question was not whether purpose-built royal vessels had value. The question was whether their value arrived at the same time as the need. While the Trinity Royal and Holy Ghost were operating, the Grace Dieu was still under construction. That creates two clocks. The shipbuilding clock moves through timber, labor, fitting, repair, and inspection. The strategic clock moves through alliances, threats, campaigns, enemy fleets, and political decisions. The ship can be progressing perfectly while the problem it was designed to solve is changing outside the yard. By around 1420, the Grace Dieu was finally ready for service. By then, other royal ships had already helped perform the urgent naval work of the previous years. The largest vessel in the program was entering service after the immediate strategic situation had shifted. That did not make it useless. It made its first operation unusually important. If the Grace Dieu could demonstrate that its size created a new level of military value, the years of spending and concentration could still look justified. If it could not be handled, supplied, or controlled, then the Crown had built the most expensive part of a system without proving that the rest of the system could use it. The voyage was also the first moment when every separate promise had to become one working reality. The hull had to be sound. Stores had to be aboard. The master and mariners had to handle a vessel unlike the ordinary ships around it. Soldiers and sailors had to occupy the same confined platform under one chain of command. An account roll could record all of those groups. It could not guarantee how they would behave together once the ship moved away from the yard. The precise cause of what happened next remains uncertain. Explanations have included the difficulty of handling such a large vessel, conditions aboard, crew size, and tensions among the people on it. The records do not give us one clean reason. The outcome is clear enough. During its one known operational voyage, the crew mutinied, and the expedition ended early. That is the point where the entire ownership fantasy changes. The king owned the ship. William Soper and the royal administration could provide stores, repairs, and equipment. Officers could carry orders aboard. Money could put men on the deck. None of that guaranteed that the men would cooperate once the vessel was underway. The failure did not happen in the forest, the shipyard, or the treasury. It happened at the human connection between all of them. And now the earlier numbers mean something different. The Crown's great ships were visible, expensive, and politically important. But the invasion fleet had depended on roughly 700, mostly commercial vessels. The Crown's taxes had to be turned into loans before they became wages. Private owners had to surrender earning assets. Crews had to be found and kept willing. Ports had to organize arrivals. Smaller ships had to carry the food, horses, equipment, and men that the great ship could not carry alone. The hull was not the thing that made naval power possible. The ability to assemble the surrounding system at the right moment was. That is why a king could own the largest ship in his fleet and still remain dependent on people he did not fully control. Merchants protecting their income, lenders judging royal promises, mariners expecting pay, craftsmen preserving wooden hulls, and ports trying to meet demands from the Crown without abandoning ordinary trade. Once the Grace Dieu returned, another problem began. A failed or unused warship did not stop costing money. Henry's great ships were laid up in the River Hamble. After Henry died in 1422, many smaller royal vessels were sold, partly to meet debts. The four great ships were retained. They still represented possible strategic value, but keeping that option alive required labor. Shipkeepers stayed aboard. Pumps had to work, seams had to be checked and caulked. Pitch and tar had to be applied. Repair crews needed food and drink. Vessels had to be moved or docked even when they were not preparing for battle. A small group of roughly 8 men is associated with maintaining the Grace Dieu during its reserve years. 8 men on an enormous ship is a striking image because their job was not to make the vessel productive. Their job was to stop it from disappearing. The Holy Ghost gives an even clearer picture of this maintenance economy. It developed leaks serious enough that a diver named Davy Owen performed underwater work in 1423. A later operation involving the ship required around 80 sailors in addition to craftsmen. The war could pause. The water did not. Wood absorbed moisture. Fastenings loosened. Seams opened. Rope degraded. Storms moved vessels. A large reserve ship consumed attention simply to remain available for a future that might never arrive. The Grace Dieu remained in the Hamble for years. It did not receive the campaign that could fully test or justify its scale. In 1439, lightning struck, and the ship burned. The obvious conclusion is that Henry spent heavily on a giant failure. That still misses something. The Grace Dieu demonstrated what English shipbuilders and administrators could construct. It carried prestige. It could have had deterrent or reserve value. It belonged to a broader program in which other great ships did perform useful work. Its failure does not prove that large royal ships were irrational. It proves that physical completion and economic usefulness are not the same event. The Trinity Royal and Holy Ghost had missions while they were available. The Holy Ghost had been rebuilt from an existing captured vessel, allowing the Crown to bring a large platform into service earlier. Those vessels still required money, crews, repair, and support, but they reached the system while the system had work for them. The Grace Dieu reached the system after the urgent problem had changed, then failed during its only known operation, then entered a maintenance cycle that lasted until destruction. The difference was not simply big ship versus small ship, it was fit, timing, and institutional support. This is also why the merchant vessels around Henry's fleet matter so much. In peacetime, their owners had reasons to maintain them. Trade kept crews practiced. Ports handled cargo. Commercial routes kept maritime knowledge alive. When the Crown needed transport, it was drawing on capacity that another economic activity had already paid to preserve. The Crown could direct some of that capacity for a campaign, but it did not create all of it from nothing. That is the deeper asset Henry needed. Not ownership of every hull, but access to a maritime economy capable of producing ships, sailors, port services, credit, tax revenue, supplies, and repair knowledge when the Crown called. England could assemble that system with remarkable speed. It could also strain it through requisition, late payment, war losses, and the cost of maintaining royal vessels between campaigns. A different model existed in Venice. The Venetian arsenals centralized ship construction, repair, stores, and specialist labor inside a permanent state institution. Venice also developed managed supply networks for timber and naval materials. The famous claim that the arsenal could complete one ship every day is disputed and belongs largely to later descriptions of its peak, but the real advantage does not need that legend. The arsenal preserved readiness between emergencies. Knowledge did not have to be reassembled around one ruler. Materials could be stored. Workers remained attached to the institution. The maritime trade supporting the state also helped sustain the system protecting that trade. That did not make Venetian naval power cheap. It meant the supporting machinery was less temporary. So, does owning a medieval warship work? It can when the vessel fits a real mission, reaches service before the mission changes, and sits inside a system able to crew, supply, finance, repair, and support it. The Trinity Royal and Holy Ghost show that large royal ships could produce real strategic value under those conditions. Ownership becomes dangerous when size is mistaken for readiness. A giant hull can absorb a large share of spending while still waiting on wages, merchant transports, port labor, credit, food, weather, and human cooperation. It can be completed after the urgent need has passed. It can survive the war and become an expensive reserve. It can remain impressive while its practical value narrows every year. At the beginning, the ship looks like the source of the owner's power. By the end, the Grace Dieu shows something else. The ship was the part everyone could see. The power was the temporary alignment of money, labor, trade, ports, and authority required to make it move.